Now, I never expected a Sony camera to beat my Canon in this way. I've got the brand new Sony A7V and I'm going to be putting it up against the Canon R6 Mark III to find out which is the best hybrid camera going into 2026. So first up, we're going to compare colours. Now, I already know that I love the R6 Mark III's colour science, and I'm honestly not too sure what to expect from the Sony. So we'll put them head to head in terms of colour science for both portraits, everyday use and landscape photography. All right, well, first up, let's take a look at a portrait, and straight away, both of these images look great, and honestly, the color science is a lot closer than I expected. Now, looking at the overall colors, I'd say that the Sony is slightly more accurate, and I can see this in the color of Rachel's jacket, which is way more accurately represented in the Sony image. The Canon image does lean a little bit warmer, which is quite flattering, especially for photographing people, whilst the Sony stays kind of consistently cooler, even though both of these shots were taken with the same white balance. And when it comes to skin tones, it's a similar story. The Sony shows more neutral, peach-leaning skin tones, and the face looks a little bit more flat, whilst the Canon image pushes skin slightly warmer, and I also notice a lot more contrast overall on the Canon shot. Overall, the Sony is a bit more accurate, whereas the Canon is a little more flattering, but not as realistic. But before we go any further into this, I want to be clear that colour is totally subjective and is heavily influenced by the software and the kind of colour profiles that you use when editing as well. And all of the photos that you're seeing today were shot using the camera standard profile on both cameras, and I edited them using each manufacturer's very own raw software. So that's Sony Imaging Edge and Canon Digital Photo Professional. And that's partly to be as fair as possible, but also because Lightroom doesn't have any of the specific camera profiles for the Sony A7V yet, so comparing the two of them in Lightroom really wouldn't be fair. And one area that I've personally struggled in the past with Sony files when it comes to portraits is in backlit scenes where the subject's face is underexposed. That really puts skin tones to the test, because in those situations, I've often found that Sony skin can go a little bit cold and magenta, sometimes looking a little bit lifeless. That said, on the Sony A7V here, I actually think the image turned out really, really nice. Rachel has very little light on her face in these images, but both cameras have held on to kind of healthy, peachy looking skin tones despite that. Personally though, I still find the Canon skin tones a bit more flattering in this specific scenario. And this is a scenario that Canon has always excelled at for me, whereas the Sony looks very good but just slightly flatter and cooler in comparison. Overall though, in most situations I found the files between these cameras to be really similar. And honestly, I really like Sony colors for kind of high dynamic range scenes, especially for things like landscapes. Sony does a great job of delivering really bold, punchy colors, and I really like the contrasty, dramatic look Canon gives straight out of camera with minimal work. But yeah, both look great, and you let me know what you think about the kind of color science differences between these two cameras. So I'm going to take a few landscape shots now on each camera. They're both 32 to 33 megapixels, so there shouldn't be a huge difference in detail, but I will check that. But what I really want to see is if there's a big difference in dynamic range between these two cameras. And just as I kind of suspected, I don't really see any meaningful difference in the level of detail between these two sensors. They're both really excellent, and I think that that kind of 32, 33 megapixel kind of range is a really nice sweet spot. You get plenty of room to crop without the file sizes becoming unmanageable. And when you do start doing really heavy crops and zooming in on the details, both cameras perform extremely well and hold up to some really kind of aggressive cropping. When I really did push things to the extreme, the Canon does seem to hang on to a tiny little bit more detail, but it's so subtle that it's kind of almost imperceivable without really zooming in, and it could just be down to a difference with the lenses rather than the sensor itself. Dynamic range though is a bit of a different story, because before trying the Sony, I'd heard a lot about how impressive the photo dynamic range in the A7V was supposed to be. Supposedly getting close to the theoretical limits of what a full frame sensor can provide in terms of dynamic range, and maybe one of the bigger leaps we've seen on the photo side of things in a few years. But is that difference really noticeable in the real world? Here I heavily overexposed a really high dynamic range scene on both of these cameras, and when pulling things back in post, I found that in terms of overexposure, they actually both handled it really well, almost identically, even down to maintaining really good contrast and color. Now, shadow recovery is where the Sony really shows its strength. And I will say it's very slightly cleaner when lifting the shadows in very heavily underexposed images, which does point to that small dynamic range advantage that I expected. That said, it's genuinely a little bit more harder to find than I expected. It's hard to find a scenario where that is really noticeable and is gonna make a difference. And I think that overall, both of these cameras have more than enough dynamic range in my experience for even the most challenging scenes. Guys, before we continue with the comparison, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. And as a photographer, I think having a site that showcases your work is an absolute must. And Squarespace just makes it so easy because there's no coding or design skills needed. It's pretty much just drag and drop. And Squarespace even now has amazing AI tools like Design Intelligence or Blueprint AI, which all help you create a personalized website in just a few easy clicks. And of course, the fully customizable photo galleries are perfect for showing off your portfolio, and I think they're the best in the business. Squarespace also has fantastic e-commerce tools that make setting up your own online store an absolute breeze. And that just means you can start selling in no time and handle many different types of payments seamlessly thanks to Squarespace payments. So if you're ready to get started, well, head on over to squarespace.com/jamesreader and use code jamesreader for 10% off your first domain or website. So in my tests, the R6 III was actually a bit of a step behind the previous R6 Mark II in terms of low light photo performance. But how does it stack up against a Sony A7V? So here's our kind of low light scene, and generally speaking, at most ISOs, the Canon is a little bit noisier. That said, it does a really good job of hanging on to fine detail compared to the Sony. You can see it in things like the roof texture at the building or in the text on the building. But once you go beyond ISO 12800 though, the Sony really starts to pull ahead, and it kind of delivers really noticeably cleaner results. I also found that at these extreme ISOs, the R6 Mark III struggles to maintain color and contrast, whereas the Sony remains surprisingly color accurate and relatively unaffected despite being at this crazy high ISO. So yeah, overall Canon holds detail early on at those lower ISOs, but Sony clearly wins at the extreme end in terms of detail, in terms of noise, and retaining accurate colors. Now looking at burst performance, the Sony has had a really nice bump up to 30 frames per second in electronic shutter, blackout free. But the R6 Mark III still leads in that sense and is the clear winner, being able to give you 40 frames per second in electronic shutter. The Canon also captures significantly more RAW files before hitting the buffer, close to 150 full RAW shots, whereas the Sony manages around 50 full lossless RAWs in 30 frames per second before that buffer is full. And it also takes a bit longer to clear that buffer once it is full compared to the Canon, which is a bit quicker. So there are a few smaller differences to cover with this though. So one of the things is that the Sony, whilst it's clearing the buffer, you can still fire off shots. Whereas on the Canon, it kind of hits a brick wall, and once it's clearing the buffer, you can't take any more shots. It's also worth mentioning that you can improve the buffer performance on the Sony by using one of the compressed RAW options, and then you get closer results to the Canon. But then it's the same story on the Canon. If you want even better performance, then you always have C-RAW. And I will say in general, I don't think that Sony's partially stacked sensor really seems to have given too much of an advantage in terms of rolling shutter performance. Both of these cameras have really good sensor readouts, despite the fact that the Canon sensor is not stacked and the Sony is partially stacked. Now, one disadvantage of the Canon is that to achieve those really high shooting speeds in electronic shutter, it drops from 14-bit to 12-bit files. So in theory, that should mean reduced dynamic range, especially in the shadows, and will lead to much weaker shadow recovery. So I tested it, shooting the same scene in electronic shutter on both cameras to see if there's any real difference in terms of shadow recovery. And yes, when we zoom in to those recovered shadows, the Sony does a better job of hanging on to detail. So yeah, you can see those dynamic range differences in the most extreme circumstances. And another big difference, especially for wildlife and sports photographers, is how each camera handles pre-capture. So on Canon, it's basically an on or off setting with very little customization available. Sony's implementation though is much more flexible, so you can adjust both the frame rate and the duration of the pre-capture, whereas yeah, on the Canon, it's always fixed at half a second at the maximum frame rate, and that is going to fill up your card very fast. So now let's dive into the video side of things, and first of all, let's talk about color. When it comes to video, the Sony gives you a few different log options, but my favorite is S-Log 3. It's very flat and it offers excellent dynamic range. The R6 Mark III is actually the first R6 series camera to finally offer C-Log 2, which is one of my favorite log profiles as well. And there's actually quite a big difference in the color science for video between these two cameras. The Sony, first of all, is noticeably more saturated compared to the Canon. So with pretty much every video camera that I've worked with, I'm usually always adding a little bit of saturation in post, but this is the first camera where I found myself actually dialing it back pretty consistently. One thing the Sony absolutely nails though is color separation, because colors are bold and they are very distinct and very clearly defined. So yeah, I think that Sony look really accentuates kind of bold colors, which in some circumstances can look fantastic, but then in other situations, sometimes it can push things a little bit too far. I also noticed that the Canon footage is generally more color accurate in video this time. So for example, the Sony, it shows Rachel's fleece as kind of a saturated red, when in reality, it's more of an orange. And I'd say that the Sony does render skin tones a little bit more accurately. So it's worth remembering that this was a freezing cold day, so Rachel was a little bit pink. That said, Canon skin tones are generally warmer and more peachy, and therefore a little bit more flattering, whereas the Sony leans a little cooler in general. What I really like about Canon's skin tones in video is that even in the kind of shadowy areas of the face, skin tends to retain its warmth and its density, whereas on the Sony, by comparison, saturation seems to drop off much more quickly in the shadows. Overall though, both do look great, and it's obviously personal preference which you prefer, and there's plenty of latitude in these files to make them look however you want. I've also noticed in the past, pretty consistently with Sony, that it can handle greens in a way that sometimes feels kind of heavier or more subdued, like in this clip. Right now in the UK, the grass doesn't look like that Sony image, where the greens are really deep and desaturated. In reality, it's closer to the Canon image, where the grass is a bit kind of brighter and leans more of a yellowy brown. And I don't dislike the Sony look at all, but it's just not particularly accurate in this scene. But yeah, I think both of these cameras look great in their own way, and I don't think many people, especially clients, are going to notice any of these differences. But that said, let me know if you guys can notice them. So I'm going to play two different sequences, and let me know in the comments which one you think was shot on the Sony and which one was shot on the Canon. And in terms of video dynamic range, I actually found them both to perform almost identically. They both have an absolute ton of dynamic range for even the most challenging situations. So even in this situation where I boosted the shadows to a kind of unreasonable amount, they both cope really well in terms of keeping detail and color, and neither of them look too noisy in the shadow as well. Quite often the Canon will be a little bit noisier, but it will hang on to detail a little bit better, but that kind of baked in noise reduction on the Sony often leads to a cleaner image. Now let's look at 4K 25p in terms of sharpness and overall image quality. And straight away, the Sony is very, very sharp. Maybe even a little bit too sharp for my taste. Because the thing is, the Canon is also very sharp, but in a different way. Side by side, to me, the Sony just looks like it has a bit of noise reduction and sharpening baked into the image. It definitely looks cleaner and sharper for sure, but not necessarily more detailed. And I'll get a very similar look with my Canon camera if I add some noise reduction in post and then follow it up with some sharpening. And that's the kind of look that I'm seeing from the Sony camera. Take this shot for example, and I notice straight away how strange the tree to the side of Rachel looks. It just appears very digitally sharp on the Sony image straight out of camera to me, but I don't know, what do you guys think? Don't get me wrong, the image still looks fantastic and it is so sharp, but this is kind of a look that I've always associated with Sony cameras. And yeah, I think that the reason is that you can't really dial back the noise reduction or sharpening that's been applied in camera. By contrast, Canon gives you full control over that. And for that reason alone, for me, Canon gets the win when it comes to 4K 25p. Okay, let's take a look at 4K 50. And on the Sony, there is a very slight crop, unfortunately, but it isn't anything too noticeable. And despite being uncropped, side by side, I'd say the Canon delivers the sharper, cleaner image. And the R6 series has always been really strong in terms of 4K 50p, and the R6 Mark III is absolutely no exception. But comparing 4K 100p between these two cameras is actually pretty interesting. Side by side, the Sony's 100p footage is noticeably sharper and very clean. It might actually be the best 100p 4K that I've seen out of any camera. The Canon though is a little bit soft, it's a little bit noisy and a bit mushy, and generally doesn't have a very good 100p image. The trade-off though is that the Sony can only shoot 4K 100p in an APS-C crop. And you'll see that straight away when we look at the two images, because the difference in background blur is pretty significant between the two shots. So there's two kind of very different approaches here. So you've got Sony's cropped 4K 100p, which is very sharp and very clean, but at the cost of the crop. Or you've got Canon, which has virtually no crop, but the image quality isn't quite as strong. And personally, I don't really love having to deal with crops in any recording mode, especially as much of a crop as an APS-C crop, where it means you're constantly having to think about reframing. But that said, one area where the Sony does have a clear advantage is in wildlife videography. Take these two clips, for example. So the Sony gets me a whole lot more closer to the robin, and the image is also a lot more detailed. And you can see immediately how useful that kind of extra reach can be in situations where distance really matters, and it's also just so much more detailed as well. One area where the Sony does fall behind is internal RAW recording. It just doesn't offer it at all. And that really sets it apart from a lot of the recent competition, whether that's from Nikon, Panasonic or Canon. And the R6 Mark III, in contrast, can shoot full 7K RAW at 25 or 50p. And honestly, the RAW footage from this camera is just incredible. It is some of the best video that I've ever gotten from a hybrid camera. It really is cinema camera level stuff with a huge amount of flexibility in post. The trade-off, of course, is massive file sizes, and yeah, it's pretty demanding on your computer when it comes to editing. But it was a pretty bold move, I think, from Sony to not include any kind of internal RAW recording. Some might argue that RAW video in a kind of photo-centric hybrid camera like this is overkill, but it does leave the A7V a step behind the competition in this respect. Another advantage that the Canon offers is open gate recording. And for video professionals working in today's kind of social media landscape, that flexibility really does matter. Being able to deliver multiple crops and framings from a single clip is a big advantage when you're working with clients. In the Canon, you can record open gate in a 7K compressed mode or even in fully RAW. And the image quality in both of these modes is just genuinely incredible. I haven't had these cameras together long enough to really judge if one's better than the other when it comes to video autofocus. And honestly, both of these cameras are among the absolute best I've ever used for video autofocus, especially with these two lenses. And for the kind of shooting that I do, I mean, they both perform pretty much flawlessly. If you are just recording people, then these cameras will never let you down. The only time I ever noticed a difference at all was in these clips of this robin. So here, the Sony eventually lost the bird, whereas the Canon kept tracking it surprisingly well as it moved pretty quickly. That said, it is just a single instance and it really doesn't mean much at all, but it is simply the only time that I saw any difference between these two cameras in terms of video AF. Another big difference between these two cameras is their approach to stabilization. So the Sony's IBIS is actually fairly weak. It's good enough to remove kind of handheld micro jitters, but it doesn't give you that kind of smooth, floaty feel that you're going to get from Canon's much stronger IBIS. The downside to that though on the Canon side of things is that it can often struggle with a kind of corner warping and wobbling, and the occasional jerky overcorrection where it almost feels like the IBIS is fighting against your movements, and it just shows in the footage, especially at those wider focal lengths. It's also worth pointing out that throughout this video, the Canon has had an advantage of not just stronger IBIS, but also from using a stabilized lens. So every Canon standard zoom at pretty much every price point offers lens image stabilization. And that's a real advantage of the Canon system, and it just gives you that extra layer of stability when shooting with lenses like these. And as a result, I found that I could consistently get sharper handheld photos at longer shutter speeds with the Canon compared to the Sony. Overall, I found Canon's IBIS to be fantastic for photo, but it is not the most natural solution for video at all. Both cameras also offer different digital stabilization options. So shooting at 24mm on the Sony with active digital stabilization enabled does get it much closer to the Canon, but at the cost of a small crop. Even then, you can still sometimes see some jerkiness in certain situations, as you can see in this footage. Canon's digital stabilization, on the other hand, isn't particularly good either. It does give you very smooth results for sure, but at wider focal lengths, I often find that it actually makes the warping a lot worse, and I'd rather just stabilize in post. Because yeah, as rough as these clips look at 24mm, they're only gonna look worse once you get down to something like 16mm. So this is the first time I've had a lens this wide on the R6 III. So this is 16mm on the 16-28, and I imagine it's gonna probably show some of the kind of wobbling, warping issues you get with Canon's IBIS. So I'll show you this, and then I'm gonna swap over to the C50 to show you why I personally prefer my video cameras at least to not have IBIS. And now this is the C50 with no IBIS at 16mm, and I personally think it just looks a little bit better for this kind of vloggy stuff. Not as stable, but at least there's no warps. But one thing I do often forget to highlight is that the Canon actually has some of the best IBIS on the market at longer focal lengths. Once you get beyond 35mm or so, the wobble pretty much disappears, and it's noticeably more stable than the Sony. That combination of really strong IBIS and stabilized lenses makes Canon a very strong option for things like wildlife and sports videography, where you want a very solid, stable handheld result. Now let's take a quick look at the low light video performance of these two cameras, and I shot this scene on both at higher ISOs to see which one is more dependable in the dark. And zooming in, starting at ISO 3200, both look very good. I'd say the Sony is slightly less noisy whilst the Canon holds on to a little bit more detail. At 6400, we're at the Canon's second base ISO, and it just looks great. It is noticeably cleaner compared to the Sony. But if you compare that to the Sony second base ISO of 8000, I'd still say the Canon looks cleaner overall, whilst the Sony maybe appears a touch sharper. At ISO 12800, both look surprisingly good, but the Canon's noise becomes a little bit more blotchy, whilst the Sony remains a little bit cleaner and its noise is a little bit finer. At ISO 25600, both are very noisy, but the Sony is definitely sharper, and I imagine it would clean up really well in post. Overall though, they actually compare very well. At the extreme end, I'd say the Sony has a small advantage over the Canon, but in most other areas, they compare almost identically. And the good news with both these cameras is that I haven't been able to get either of them to overheat in 4K 25p. And I think that's a pretty big improvement over the A7 IV, which would overheat in that mode. In downsampled 4K 50, the Canon will overheat in about 30 minutes. The Sony, by comparison, completely filled my 256GB card with about an hour and 50 minutes of footage with no signs of overheating. In 4K 100p, which isn't downsampled on the Canon, it's still overheated in about 30 to 35 minutes. The Sony, on the other hand, again, didn't show any signs of overheating at all. I recorded for over an hour with no issues. So yes, crops can be annoying, but clearly they must help with overheating. Sony does seem to have prioritized reliability over flashy specs on the video side here, and that is probably a sensible trade-off. It's still a little early to make judgments about battery life, but I did notice the R6 Mark III is a bit of a step down compared to the R6 Mark II, despite using a new type of battery. Whereas the Sony, on the other hand, is still using the same old Sony batteries as forever, yet it seemed to consistently last a little bit longer. In all of my tests, the Sony finished with more charge remaining than the Canon, so it's fair to say I think that the Sony takes the win on battery life. Now, one thing I really appreciate about the Canon is the range of exposure tools that it offers. So you get things like waveform, and you even get false color now, which is just incredibly useful for getting exposure right in camera. Unfortunately, on the Sony side, you're pretty much limited, I think, just to histogram. At least that's all I could find in the menus. The Canon also has a tally light, which is another useful feature that the Sony lacks. And it's also a real shame, I think, that neither of these cameras offer shutter angle. They're both clearly very capable video cameras, but that's one feature that's missing on both. Now, I never expected a Sony camera to beat my Canon in this way. And it's the screen, because it's actually one of the best screens I've ever used on a hybrid camera in this price range. So yeah, I love this Sony screen because not only can it now flip up and down, but it can still fully rotate out to the side, and you can kind of film from the front if you want to. And this just gives you the best of both worlds. By comparison, the Canon screen is great, but it does still only flip out to the side. The screen itself on the Sony is also a big improvement over the A7 IV. because I really did not like the screen on that camera at all. It felt low quality and pretty uninspiring to look at. Sony has doubled the resolution here, and it definitely shows in the quality of the screen. Another difference is the Sony now has 2 USB-C ports, which is surprisingly useful. So it means you can do things like tether and charge the camera at the same time, or you can use it as a webcam over USB-C whilst also using power delivery. One thing I really like about the Sony is the extra function buttons and customizable buttons over the Canon. But when it comes to overall build and ergonomics though, it's obviously down to personal preference which of these you're going to prefer, but for me, I personally way prefer the feeling of the Canon camera. In fact, it's actually one of the main reasons why Canon is my system of choice. I love the kind of smooth edges and generous grip on the R6 Mark III. It just feels really nice in the hand, and it's comfortable, and it genuinely feels like it was designed by someone who has held a heavy camera for a full day on a shoot. By comparison, the Sony has a lot more sharper edges and a noticeably smaller grip. In fact, the grip on the A7V feels way closer to my Canon RP than it does to my R6. And yeah, the R6 Mark III just has a much larger grip, and with the Sony, I just don't feel like I get the same kind of secure hold of the camera. That said, the Sony setup is noticeably smaller overall and also a little bit lighter, so if you do prefer a more compact kit for travel, for example, then Sony generally keeps things smaller than Canon. One difference worth mentioning is the media types. So Sony uses a CF Express Type A, which likely helps enable those new faster speeds, as well as an SD card, whereas the R6 Mark III, on the other hand, now uses a CF Express Type B slot alongside an SD card slot. One thing I do really appreciate about the Sony is that its CF Express Type A slot is dual purpose, so you can use it for CF Express cards or standard SD cards. And that flexibility isn't something you get on the Canon. I also personally much prefer Canon's menus, and yes, I'm definitely just way more familiar with them at this point, but still, I prefer this kind of page-based system. I find the settings more digestible and intuitive, and there aren't as many kind of cryptic abbreviations like you get in the Sony menus. That said, Sony really excels when it comes to customizability. You can change almost anything in the menu on this camera and genuinely make the camera feel like your own, completely dialed in exactly how you want it. And paired with those extra function buttons, that level of control over your camera is extremely powerful. But another big area to consider is the lens mount itself. So I'll keep this short because it's probably not new information to most people watching this. But at the moment, Canon does restrict third-party manufacturers from releasing full-frame autofocus lenses for RF mount. Sony, on the other hand, allows manufacturers like Sigma, Tamron, Samyang and Viltrox all to produce third-party lenses across a whole wide range of budgets. And that's just got to be a huge deciding factor for a lot of people, because from a consumer's point of view, more choice is always better. Canon does, of course, have EF lenses that you can adapt, but it would still be great to see more native third-party options in the future on RF mount. So yeah, both of these cameras are incredible. And this was actually a really fun comparison to put together, because these are two very highly anticipated cameras, and it genuinely feels like Sony and Canon have taken very different approaches with these cameras. The Sony A7V feels like a safe, sensible evolution over the A7 IV, clearly focused on photo improvements like a faster blackout-free burst rate with no compromise in image quality, whilst taking a kind of more conservative approach to video specs, prioritizing reliability over headline specs. You get absolutely excellent battery life, solid dynamic range, and virtually no overheating concerns. An IBIS that, while not groundbreaking in any way, at least won't ruin your clips at those wider focal lengths. The Canon R6 Mark III, on the other hand, feels like, especially on the video side, Canon just decided to throw everything at this camera. You get some seriously flashy specs, you get excellent exposure tools, uncropped 4K 100, 7K RAW up to 50, and even open gate recording, which I don't think anybody really expected from Canon on an R6 camera. The trade-off is that you do have to live with a bit of overheating, and IBIS that's extremely strong and effective, but can be problematic at those wider focal lengths. On the photo side of things, there's nothing really groundbreaking with the Mark III, but you do get great colors, and that jump from 24 to 32 megapixels is still a really solid upgrade over the R6 Mark II. But anyway guys, let me know what you think. Which of these cameras is the best, and which system would you go with in 2026? I'll upload a couple of raw photos and video files so you can download them and check out any of the differences that you saw in this video for yourself. But that's it. Hopefully this video was helpful, guys. Thank you guys as always so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.